All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valerian Sikhuashvili. I'm the Director of Academic Programs here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. And I want to thank you all for joining us, whether you're doing so live right now or watching the recording afterwards, for joining us for this discussion with Professor Michael Kimmage on his latest book, Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. Here it is in my hands, and hopefully after this conversation, and after this discussion, in your hands as well. Usually when we read books about wars, and at AHS, we like to read books of all kinds, and we focus on understanding the wars as well. Usually they're a matter of history and the past, but sadly this war is not just a matter of historical analysis as it continues today. Consequently, it's critical that we understand the origins, not only for that historical curiosity that we all have and the lessons that we can learn from wars for the future, but in this case, also hopefully he can help us determine what victory looks like for the Ukrainian people and how that can be achieved. And Michael has given us a wonderful resource for that with this book, both for understanding the origins of the war, learning the valuable lessons from some of the failures, some of what we had done well, and hopefully finding a solution in this conflict. And that is no surprise that he has given us this wonderful resource, given his knowledge and background. Michael specializes in the history of the Cold War, in the 20th century U.S. diplomatic and intellectual history, and U.S.-Russian relations since 1991. He's a professor of history and the department chair at the Catholic University of America, and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2014 to 2016, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He has also worked at the German Marshall Fund and Wilson Center. Michael, thank you so much for joining us, for your willingness to discuss this book with our audience. I look forward to discussing it and getting the audience member engaged as well with you at the end. Just to give all of you an idea about the structure and format of this discussion, I'll ask Michael questions for about 30-35 minutes, loosely following the structure of the book. We'll start with Putin's rise, reset, the Maidan Revolution. We'll arrive at 2022, what happened with the decision on the part of Russia to invade, and then what are some lessons. We'll talk about NATO as well and Ukraine, and then leave 30 minutes or so, 25-30 minutes for you to ask questions directly. You can submit your questions in writing. You should submit them in writing, and you can start submitting them as Michael and I are having a discussion, and I'll call on you at the end. I'll unmute you, and you can ask questions. Your video will turn on, and you can ask questions, Michael, directly. So we have giving you opportunity to engage with him. With that, let's start with the discussion. Michael, thank you again for joining us. There are a lot of places to start in the book, a lot of important events, ideas, but I thought we'd start with the title, Collisions. When we talk about this war, it's Russia-Ukraine war. That would be a collision, but you write collisions. So tell us of that framing, what that means, and then with that framing, we'll get started. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the very kind introduction, Valerian, and it's always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you and to be in conversation with the wonderful affiliates of the Alexander Hamilton Society. So with this audience in mind, there are two things that I'd like to try to emphasize in the course of our conversation today, and this is the ways in which we can study the war. There are the conclusions to draw and the judgments to make, but there's also the ways that we can study it, and also because of the ambitions that people in the AHS hold, what are the policy implications? What are the policy deliverables that you can get from hopefully a careful and clear understanding of why the war broke out and of the course it's taken so far? So with that in mind, the three collisions that matter for the book's title and for the content of the book, of course, as you mentioned, Russia-Ukraine, that's the primary framing for the war because these are the two armies involved, the two nation states that are involved. The historian Serhiy Plokhy, a historian of the Soviet Union and of Ukraine, has said that predicted that this war will be nation building for both Russia and Ukraine. And I think that's entirely correct. And we want to, sort of think carefully about, of course, that obvious but very important framing for the war. Not less obvious, perhaps, and certainly not less central, is the Russia-Europe framing. That this is, on the one hand, a battle between Russia and Ukraine in military terms, But there's also a battle being conducted over the security architecture of Europe, which Russia is trying to shape and direct in one way, in which Europe, broadly construed, whether it's the NATO alliance, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the individual countries of Europe, are also trying to create a security structure, security architecture for Europe of their own design. And of course, Europe's design and Russia's design are completely incompatible. And so that's why it's not as if Russia and Europe are at war with each other, but there's a very, very high degree of tension. And then thirdly, there's the US and Russia. And I don't know how intimately involved the US was in 2014. Of course, I worked at the State Department at the time, and so I can say that many of us were sort of working hard on the issue, but it was not a whole of government effort. But by the time you get to 2021, 2022, I think the US has become a prominent part of the story. And I think as we've learned in the course of the war, the nature of the US military commitment to Ukraine really matters, whether it's there or whether it's wavering. It seems to have an impact on the course of the war itself. This lends the war its nuclear component to the extent that that's there. And I think it also really serves to globalize the war because some of what Russia is doing vis-a-vis North Korea is related to the war in Ukraine, but that has implications for U.S. policy in the Asia Pacific. And of course, Russia-China is an even more important axis that's been reshaped and changed by the war in Ukraine. And all of that has lots of consequences for U.S. grand strategy and the global position of the United States, not to mention implications for the Middle East that are flowing from this war. So I would like to sum up this point by saying that these are three separate collisions. I think
Mhm.
each has a different point of origin. I try to lay that out in the book, a different chronology, a different inner logic, and a different dynamic. And I don't think that these three phases of conflict or these three collision points are going to terminate all on the same day.
Sure.
I would hope that they would all terminate very soon, sort of on our terms, but that's unlikely to happen. And there will be different end phases to these conflicts. And I think there are lots of policy implications for that, but let me leave it at that, that we can't really look at the war in the singular also for policy purposes. We have to think about its layered nature.
Great, great, wonderful, and we'll hopefully come back to that when we talk about how this ends and what victory looks like. You mentioned there's three separate collisions, but in a way, there's one man at the center in some way with this all three separate collisions. That's Putin. So I wonder if we can go kind of to the chapter that you talk about Putin in the book about and telling us about his vision for Russia's role in the world when he comes into power. He gets picked by Eltsin, comes to power, and then there's the initial kind of ways he's looking at the world. Then we have the Munich speech. So what I wonder if you can give us kind of a little bit of evolution or the perception of Putin for
Sure.
when he comes, and then what happens in a decade following.
Well, the perception, I'll start with the perception because it's a slightly different story, I think, from the reality,
Yeah,
which has
yeah,
become more clear over time. And I think the perception, of course, it's different if you're perceiving this from Tbilisi or from Warsaw or from Vilnius or from Lisbon or Minneapolis or Washington D.C. The perceptions vary, of course. But I think on balance, outside of Eastern and Central Europe, the perception of Putin for the first roughly 8 years of his rule, 2000 to 2008, was that he was hard-edged and aggressive at times, but that he was a Russian modernizer, and that his ultimate and eventual goal was to integrate Russia into the global economy, integrate Russia into Europe, and maybe there would be speed bumps along the way and difficulties. The Russia-Georgia war could perhaps be classified as one of those in this context, but they were overcomable. That's, sort of 2000 to 2008. We'll skip over Medvedev. That deserves probably
we'll talk.
focus in its own right.
Yeah,
This perception shifts. It really changes, and it takes a while for it to shift completely, but it starts to shift in 2011, 2012, when Putin returns to the presidency of Russia, um, quite a bit more hard-edged than he was before, and more culturally conservative, more anti-Western. That takes a while to build up steam. And then, of course, 2014 annexation of Crimea is a turning point. But even that, it was, again, lingering over the subject of perceptions. Even that doesn't completely change the perception of Putin. Because I think really until February 2022, there's the sense that Putin can be worked with. You can kind of strike a deal.
yeah,
You can negotiate something. And that lingers on all the way until 2022. Um, the reality is, I think, not that the Putin of 2022 was always there
mm,
or that it's completely linear. But I think the reality I would put this way, that Putin is a rather traditional Russian leader. both in the fact that he's authoritarian in style. That, of course, takes one back to Soviet history and Imperial Russian history. But he also, and this is almost a cliche about Russian history, that he modernizes the country for the sake of allowing it to write the rules of its neighborhood as Russia perceives its neighborhood. So in that sense, you can sort of put Putin in line with various Soviet leaders and various czars as a kind of modernizer for the sake of not just national greatness, but preeminence in the neighborhoods that matter to Russia. And I think it just took Putin a while to get where he got by 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and then certainly by 2022. I mean, that's a pretty radical step that it took, and it took him a while to get there. But the framework is not in a way that elaborate. And by the standards of Russian and Soviet history, this framework is not that surprising. Not that you can go back to Peter the Great to predict the war in 2022, but the kind of leader that Putin is almost the kind of leader that we should have expected him to be from the beginning.
So you mentioned and Georgia in 2008, and you mentioned in the book as well that the Georgia war did not dispel Washington's hopes or this kind of a more optimistic, positive perception. I wonder if what might be some of the kind of, other than just general optimism of the West, what are the reasons why those perceptions were not dispelled, and we did not see that Putin maybe was just kind of trying to build up Russia so you could write the rules for its neighborhood and do what Russian kind of imperial rulers had done before, or Russia in its history had done?
I mean, I think there are a few things that come to mind here, and they sort of span different Republican and Democratic administrations with different emphases in different ones. But one is the sense that we had sort of moved beyond a period of great power conflict and conventional war, that there were, yes, wars of terrorism and sort of other issues that might push countries into war, but sort of major, sort of great power war was a thing of the past. Maybe it goes back to the 1930s and the 1940s, but it's not of our era and not of our moment. There might be cyber conflicts or high-tech conflicts, but a major conventional war in Europe was sort of unthinkable. So that's one piece of the story. The kind of war that Putin initiated really in 2022 was one that policymakers had a very, very difficult time envisioning, whether it would be Russia or any other country that would generate that kind of war. So that's one point to make. Another point to make is a kind of hard to explain in retrospect, but naive optimism about Europe as just this engine or motor of integration and peace. That's not, of course, entirely naive, because that's exactly what Europe was after 1991 in big and meaningful ways. I don't want to minimize that, but it wasn't universal. And of course, the Russia-Georgia war is very important in that respect, because not only does it happen, but the two pieces of territory that Russia bites off are pieces of territory that Russia holds on to. So it's not as if, that was resolved in the way that we would stereotypically think of Europe resolving its problems after 1991. So I would mention that as well, a kind of strange almost belief in Europe as a generator of peace, when that really wasn't per se the case. But finally, and I think this is maybe overpowering vis-a-vis the other two explanations, I just don't think that Russia was understood to be that important. Maybe it was bad. Maybe it was authoritarian. Maybe it had retained the elements that we didn't want it to retain of its Soviet past or Imperial Russian past. But, the wave of the future was in Asia.
Right.
China was the serious country. It's Brazil and India, other places that are sort of on the move. And Russia is this, sort of sluggish country that's on the, sort of backside of globalization without a lot of innovation and economic dynamism there. And therefore, it's just not that important. I don't think anybody would have spelled it out exactly like that, but I think that's a kind of subliminal assumption about Russia, that even if it's a problem, as it was in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia, well, that's kind of it. Or annexation of Crimea, that's it. That's the extent of it. That's the scope of it. And that proved to be really acutely wrong.
Right. And I think we all remember that debate moment between President Obama and Romney, when Romney talks about Russia as a big geopolitical threat, and Obama says, the 19th century is asking back. So let's talk a little bit more about the Obama administration's reset as well. And then you were part of the State Department as well. Other than that kind of diagnosis of Russia and a little bit of other reasons, what are the underlying other assumptions about hoping that Russia could integrate, or that kind of the outreach, the reset, as well as maybe Medvedev's role and a little bit, and how Obama saw him, and kind of that translated into a way he saw Russia. I thought that was an interesting kind of a parallel and conversation that you talked about in the book.
So, since I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Valerian, this ways of studying the war
Hmm.
is important for us as students of this moment and as people who also are interested in making policy recommendations. One thing that is important is to have empathy for decision makers in the past, even when they're wrong, or maybe especially when they're wrong. So I think the simple point to make is that the reset was maybe not a mistake in and of itself. I mean, it kind of helped the US with Afghanistan, and there were certain practical benefits that came from the reset, arms control, a few other things. You know, for the Obama administration, it was JCPOA, and that was kind of useful to have a reset with Russia for that sake. I don't think any of those things were mistakes. I just think it was fit into a narrative that was really of our invention, of,
Hmm.
you know, sort of Russia joining our world, playing by our rules, in a way becoming one of us. And that narrative was really deeply mistaken. And by contemporary standards, when we kind of know what happened, also very costly, that narrative, because it blinded us to certain things that were happening at the time. But and you know, that's the most important point to make, and we need to learn
Yeah,
from that, as you know, I'm sure we'll sort of
sure.
start to
Yeah.
discuss in just a moment. But to understand how the mistake could be made, to have empathy for the the policymakers, and in this case the mistake makers, uh, it was impossible to know that Medvedev would be rotated out in 2012 as he was. He comes into power in 2008. It wasn't impossible to know that he was kind of a puppet and that the real decision maker was Putin, but you know, nobody had a crystal ball. And also, it was difficult to read Medvedev's statements at the time, you know, because as I quote in the book, he goes to Davos in 2011. He says, well, the Arab Spring that's what you get when governments are not receptive to their populations. And he does abstain at the UN when it comes to the vote about the military action in Libya. So, you know, if you kind of overinterpret those statements, you get a Medvedev who's really benign, and then you kind of project future Medvedevs or people who are easier to work with than Medvedev, and you get this real complacency about Russia that was very, very strong in those years and took a long time to dissipate. So it's not that I want to go back in the past and justify the mistakes that were made then, but that's how I would understand them. You know, wishful thinking would be probably the sharpest explanation.
Okay, good, good. Thank you for that. Let's talk about the Maidan Revolution. So 2013 and then 2014. Um, Tell us a little bit about that context. I think a lot of people watching now, because of the 2022, the Maidan Revolution has gone kind of in the background, but that's kind of the where things really begin tangibly. What were the internal factors that led to the revolution? It starts with as a protest against Yanukovych's decision to not sign the association agreement. What was that about? You write in the book that the revolution came about, the Maidan Revolution, about because of unresolved questions in Ukrainian politics and foreign policy, and that the association agreement didn't just provoke questions about the Ukrainian economy, it provoked the question of Ukraine's true nature, of its core identity. So I wonder if you can flesh that out, that a little bit for our audience, that moment.
Yes. No, it's crucially important, and I agree that this is not getting the attention that it deserves at the moment as a feature of the contemporary landscape. And you know, I think that major revolutions, and the Maidan was one of those, don't happen for small reasons. You don't get an American Revolution or a French Revolution for small reasons. You know, the Boston Tea Party was not just about tea; it was about people's agency within the British Empire, and that too. I mean, I think in some ways the American Revolution is really quite useful in this context. That did provoke questions of identity that then created a sense of Americanness, which fed into a revolution that had all kinds of geopolitical repercussions. So we could use that as a very basic and kind of simple analogy, but that maybe gets us into the subject. So just 3 points, which I'll try to
Yeah.
articulate quickly. Maidan Revolution is the immediate catalyst is a program in the European Union, which touches on 6 post-Soviet countries: Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, called the Eastern Partnership Program, which was an invitation not to join the EU, but to draw closer. And that stimulated in certain parts of the Ukrainian population a real desire to make good on this growing bond with Europe. That was not necessarily in 2011 or 2012 understood to be as something that was deeply in conflict with Russia, or a sort of binary choice that comes a little bit later. but there is this inclination toward Europe, and that's intensified by the Eastern Partnership Program, and that sort of poses the question. The second point is the sort of first answer to the question of where Ukraine is supposed to go in 2013 is just the Yanukovych presidency in and of itself. So Yanukovych, from a kind of criminal background, rises up in eastern Ukraine, becomes the president of Ukraine in 2010, and he's just a thuggish guy. And there's a lot of misrule that's happening. Of course, this too is going to flow into the revolution. That's not necessarily existential or geopolitical in nature. It's sort of corruption, clannish family domination of politics that's just generating a lot of discontent and anger. But that, of course, merges with the first point about the larger course of the country when Yanukovych decides not to sign the association agreement. This was October of 2013, and people start to gather on the streets to protest that decision. And because he's a thug, he responds to that with a kind of cowardly violence that actually really generates the revolution as much as anything else. But the third point that I would mention is Russia's mismanagement of this situation. That Russia wishes to have lots of influence in Ukraine. We could put it very politely in that way. It
Mm-hmm.
has a lot of influence through Yanukovych, but the influence runs through corruption and through this very unlovable figure of Yanukovych. So in a sense, Russia bets on the wrong person in 2013, and then they're really stuck when the revolution comes because they don't have a way of easily navigating it. They don't have a way of reaching out to both sides. They're kind of stuck with the figure of Yanukovych, and so they really try to prop him up. And that ends up backfiring. Yanukovych flees the country in the third week of February 2014. He flees the country to Russia, and he just looks in the end like he's a Russian puppet, which he wasn't exactly, but that's the perception. So in a way, I'll just leave it at this because there's a lot more to say, but this is a key point. Russia taints itself in Ukraine, even among people who didn't necessarily think of themselves as anti-Russian. They taint themselves through Yanukovych and through their response to the revolution. So, Russia's mismanagement of this revolution is also part of the story.
Yeah, great. And I hope in the interest of time, I want to ask next on 2022, jump to that, but I hope some of our audience members will have questions on what happened right after the Maidan revolution. I think that's another critical time and period. But yeah, let me jump to 22 and then kind of the larger invasion or round two, as you mentioned in the book. You write that Putin wanted to kind of talking about the larger reasons or causes for this, you write that Putin wanted to reinscribe the rules of Russian history on the territory of Ukraine, making it once again a part of Russian Empire, and that Putin would accept only a sovereign Ukraine that paid homage to Russia, that limited its ties to Europe and to the West, and that acknowledged explicitly or tacitly Ukraine's place within the Russian sphere of influence. So I thought that was a very insightful kind of a framing and analysis and summary of way Putin sees Ukraine. I wonder if you can kind of discuss a little bit more of that way Putin desire. Where does that come from? Is it how much of it? I guess what I'm trying to get to is how much of it is that kind of come from security interest and fear and paranoia, as we hear a lot of it is that Ukraine drifting towards the West or Georgia or other countries, that's a legitimate security concern that motivates Russia's fears, or how much of it is more of kind of this imperial identity that Russia has, that without which it's almost like Russia cannot exist without having Ukraine be under its influence or those republics there are around it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So let's start with the security concerns and then progress from them. I think they just overlap with issues of imperial identity or, so the Russian view, especially. I mean, we could have a long conversation about Russia and Georgia, but I think it's a bit different with Belarus and Ukraine, which occupy a somewhat different place in the Russian imagination or the sort of cultural imagination also, especially of Putin. I'm not sure all of Russians are in this category, but certainly Putin is in an important cultural category in terms of his relationship to this space. So of course Russia has a huge border with Ukraine, and you could go back into history and look at different invasions of Russia that come from the West, and you can see that Ukraine is going to be strategically important to Russia. You have the peculiar status of Crimea after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you had a Russian naval base in Sevastopol, but Crimea, of course, is a part of Ukraine. So that's a kind of sort of peculiarity. For this reason, Ukraine is going to occupy a big place in Russian strategic culture. But what one has to say is that there's something, the importance is not difficult to determine, but there's something deeply counterproductive about the way Russia has related to Ukraine after 1991, that if the issue is sort of securing Russia's borders and guaranteeing that there's no threat from the West, that the easier path would have been to have just decent relations with Ukraine and to do things that would sort of disarm, whatever is potentially threatening from Europe. But in a sense, Russia has done the opposite by coercively trying to control Ukraine, through manipulation until Yanukovych, through military force after Yanukovych. Russia has actively pushed the population of Ukraine almost into Europe. And so in a sense, Russia has created the problem that it feels that it has to solve in Ukraine. I don't think that this is unique in the annals of neighboring countries, but it's certainly a very unfortunate dynamic. And so it's difficult in a kind of rational sense to understand what real threats Russia has been addressing since 1991. But in kind of peculiar ways, they've created certain problems that they have then chosen to solve through military force. So it's sort of in strategic terms. In the end, I mean, maybe it's to rush ahead in our conversation. I think Russia's whole position on the country is going to be disastrous for Russia. That they've sort of mismanaged. I mentioned mismanaging the figure of Yanukovych, but I think they've sort of mismanaged the strategic dynamic that's at work there. But it flows from a sense of threat that is there in Moscow, and then the imperial identity touches much more on questions of culture, ethnicity, language, and religion. And we'll just make two quick points in that regard. That it's not a shock that Russians have these concerns because the Soviet Union collapses, and I think it's 30 million quote unquote ethnic Russians who are left outside of Russian borders after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So any government, the German government, sort of deals with the legacy of its shrunken territory after the Second World War and kind of ethnic Germans who are outside of Germany. It's not bad or surprising that this would be an issue for the Russian government, sort of Russian speakers and their fate, but it's been cooked up into something very elaborate with a strong sense of entitlement, as if Russia really has the right in Belarus and Ukraine to call the shots. And so I think for normal people, there's, yes, a concern with the status maybe of Russian speakers in Ukraine or how our sort of friends and relatives doing over there, but that gets overlaid with a sense that this is territory that Russia is entitled to control. To me, that's a bit more Putin than your average Russian, but at this point, 2.5 years into this war, there's less space between Putin and the average Russian on some of these questions. But Putin took a kind of genuine concern that people had and developed it into something that's neo-imperial or quasi-imperial.
Great, great. There's a lot more, both about the Maidan Revolution and the reasons for the 2022 invasion. But luckily, there's a book there, so hopefully the audience can get that and dig deeper into that. What I want to discuss next is the Western response to both 2014 and 2022. What kind of comparing and contrasting in some way in 2024. There was a difference, even the response between Europe and US. Then there's an obvious difference in how we in the US responded to 2014 and how we responded to 2022. So tell us, kind of compare and contrast, and what is the variability in the US and European responses in 2014 and 2022?
So in 2014, the key difference between 2014 and 22 is the psychological sense that you can kind of turn back the clock after 2014. You can still go back. And this is captured in the key metaphor that the White House uses in 2014, which is the need to create an off-ramp for Russia. So the highway is still going in the right direction. Russia's turned in the wrong way. We need to build for them an off-ramp so that they can once again travel in the right direction. And from this flows a lot of policy consequences, that the sanctions regime is a pretty optimistic policy in 2014. We just need to keep it there long enough. It's going to convince Russians that this is the wrong path. They'll sort of come back to Europe, and the sanctions will be a pressure point that will push them to do that, and then the lifting of sanctions will be the reward when Russia once again wishes to become a part of the European club or a part of the transatlantic club. And we can kind of get back to where we were supposed to be in the 1990s of this larger process of integration. That remains still very strong in the European government, that mentality, in the German government, maybe a little bit less in the British. I think it's there in the French government. And of course, there's a lot of skepticism about this in Eastern and Central Europe already in 2014. But among the key big countries, there's really this mentality of the annexation of Crimea and the Russian incursion into Eastern Ukraine as reversible. And that's profoundly important. You know, if you want to distinguish between the American and the European response in 2014, what's a bit baffling is just how complacent the Europeans are. In the spring of 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, there are no European sanctions put on Russia for the annexation of Crimea. European sanctions are placed on Russia only after the shoot down of MH17 in the summer of 2014, which involved a lot of Dutch citizens and European citizens who were killed, sort of in the sky over Ukraine during the summer conflicts there. And that really changed the European perception. But amazingly, the annexation of Crimea didn't all that much. I mean, the US is still kind of in la-la land in 2014, but maybe a little bit less so, marginally less so than Western European countries are in that year. 2022 is profoundly different, profoundly different. There's no sense that Russia is going to go back to some sort of workable state of affairs. It is acknowledged in 2022 that Russia's ambitions are at the very least the partition of Ukraine, maybe the conquest of the entire country, and that there could be other European countries in Russia's sights. And here's kind of the media dimension of things, the scale of human suffering. I mean, it's considerable in 2014, but it's a lot bigger in 2022, and that involves European populations and the American population in what's going on in Ukraine in a much more visceral and intense way. So there's actually pressure from the bottom up, from societies on politicians to do something, which was not the case in 2014. If anything, it was sort of policymakers who were pushing in 2014 to do something. Populations were maybe a little bit distant from the conflict, and that's not the case in 2022. So it's not reversible. It could have implications for all of Europe. It entails a lot of, sort of civilian suffering. And so the kinds of policies, the kind of engagement that's required for the West is an order of magnitude greater.
Okay, wonderful. So let me ask one more question, and before I have others, but I'll after my question, the next one, then I'll go to some of the questions in the Q&A. I see one. Please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A chat box, and then I'll call on you. But let me ask this question about how this ends. You mentioned in the book as well that we analyze wars, we talk about this, what happened, what were the origins, but the people suffering, the Ukrainian people, that's what's at the heart of it, and we all want it to end in some way. How would you define victory for the Ukrainian people and for Ukraine? Obviously, that would it might look different from an Ukrainian perspective, or if you're a person there, a leader, but kind of as an outsider, as a policymaker, what would the victory for Ukrainian people in Ukraine look like?
Well, let's go back for a moment to the mistakes that we made in the past, since it is the premise of my book and the premise of my approach that we can learn from them and create policy deliverables. So two mistakes I'll just generalize about.
Yeah.
A kind of cheap optimism that things are going to work out. It will all be fine. That's sort of astonishing to think that could be the attitude after the annexation of Crimea, but I think it kind of was. And well into 2015 and 2016, when the fighting subsides in Ukraine, that sort of cheap optimism really returns with a vengeance. And the other problem or core mistake, I would say, of the United States and of its European partners was an affection for half measures when it comes to Ukraine. So you do it halfway. You support Ukraine, you sanction Russia, but you don't really think of outright military support. I have 2015 in mind. You say that Eastern Partnership Program is available, but the European Union, it seems like it's a step too far. We can get into NATO and all of the promises sort of made there. 2008, it's affirmed that one day Georgia and Ukraine will be NATO members, but there isn't the institutional will in NATO to really move forward with that. It's another half measure. And half measures, when it comes to this, have the really unfortunate quality of being provocative to a degree in Moscow, given how Moscow reads, the world, and at the same time not helpful and useful for Ukraine. So that's a point that's widely made about, sometimes the worst of all possible worlds, but it really stems from this affection for half measures. So no cheap optimism. Let's recognize the scale of the challenge and the problem. It's huge. Even if Russia is sort of defeated on the battlefields in the next couple of years, I don't think that the challenge goes away, because it's possible that Russia could return in the future to invasions of Ukraine and to efforts to do what they were trying to do in 2022. So we can't have easy or cheap optimism. We have to recognize that this is a generational challenge that's going to take many years to deal with, and it's going to demand sort of our full attention, and will really be hard, not easy, but hard. And then the half measures. I mean, I think we're 3/4 of the way through the half measures. I don't know mathematically where that puts us. US and Europe is doing so much more in 2024 than they were in 2014. So there's been a big trajectory, you could say, of sort of increased engagement. But it's a good thing to bring up at the time of the NATO summit. You really can't dangle these things in front of Ukraine. You have to sort of think about what you're able to back up. I use the phrase in the book, that we've, in general, looking back to even 1991, we've overpromised when it comes to Ukraine and underdelivered. So here's what I would say by way of the mentality that we should have with policymaking. We should underpromise, we should say very little, and we should overdeliver. And that would be one of the great gifts that could be given at this moment, in addition to all the practicalities of military support, which is an important subject unto itself. But these half measures have been really costly, and it would be worth transcending them to something that just resemble actual measures.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Let me go to the Q&A section now. So I see the first question from Julian. So Julian, I will allow you to talk, so you can go ahead and ask your question to Michael directly. So I just pressed the button.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. So with Russia's continuing international isolation and more like nationalistic or imperial, like expansionist, like stance, do you think Russia will continue to try to use more violent means to achieve it, like its objectives, and both military and through clandestine means? Actually, while we're in the meeting, CNN reported that about an hour ago, the U.S. and Germany foiled an attempted assassination of Rheinmetall CEO. So I just wanted your take on that.
Sure.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, that's commentary as up to the minute as possible. Julian, I'd like to politely dispute your assumption that Russia is isolated internationally. One of the striking features of the war, to me, what I couldn't have predicted at the outset, is that actually Russia, for all of the ways in which it's really underperformed on the battlefield, and that continues to be an important fact of the war, has, I think, overperformed when it comes to forming global connections, creating new markets for its energy resources, through smuggling, through what's called the roundabout trade, through even legal channels, or sort of open channels, getting material into the country and technological goods. I think I just read about one of the missiles used in the attack on the Ukrainian hospital from the last 48 hours, that it had American components in it, technological components in it. And that speaks to the many ways in which Russia has remained open to the world, and the world has remained open to Russia. And I don't think without that, Russia would be able to prosecute such a long war. So we need to think of Russia as a global power, as a globalized power, newly, differently globalized because of the war, but not especially isolated. Of course, we just had Prime Minister Modi making his first state visit to Moscow over the last couple of days, which is indicative of something important. So it may be true that Russia is going to seek to escalate. That's very possible, what you're asking about, Julian. But I don't think it would be driven by a feeling of isolation. I think if it's going to be driven by anything, it's just a huge frustration that there has to be in the Kremlin about how the war is basically going nowhere. Over the last year, what has Russia accomplished in military terms? They've taken Bakhmut and Avdiivka, which are two little, not little, but I think Bakhmut before the war was maybe 100,000 people, 80,000 people, and Avdiivka is sort of a medium-sized town. There are thousands of these towns in Ukraine. And so at this pace, the war is just going to go on forever for Russia with very, very little progress. So that may in turn lead to escalation, the instilling of fear in the German population, maybe it's just retribution or vengeance at this point that's playing a role. But absolutely, we should be prepared for more of these methods, because I think Russia has a lot of tools in that domain, and they have very few inhibitions. Whether it will really work for Russia in terms of its war effort, I'm skeptical, but this is the kind of thing I would expect to see more of.
Great. Thank you, Michael. All right, next question I see is from Connor. I'm gonna unmute you, Connor, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. In retrospect, what should the Obama administration have done in the wake of the Maidan revolution? How could they have been tougher against Russia? And do you think that them being tougher against Russia in that time period would have somehow won over Europe to the cause? Or was that just not in the cards at all at that point in time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Connor. One thing that you have to factor in, and I could speak at great length about this because I do remember this sort of firsthand, is that there were lots of domestic political constraints, maybe more in Germany than there were in the US. I don't think the US is so squeamish about military action, but that was definitely the case in 2014. That's changed since 2022 in Germany, not 100%, but it has changed. But Angela Merkel really channeled that kind of reluctance to do anything military. In fact, she said, and I quote it in the book, there's no military solution to the problem of what's happening in Ukraine. So I don't know if any amount of advocacy or persuasion on Obama's part could have changed Angela Merkel's mind, or brought many more Europeans along with a tougher US policy. I think that would have been hard, although perhaps there would have been allies in different European countries, maybe UK, Poland, Baltic republics, that you could have just used to move Europe, and the resistance wouldn't have been that meaningful. But there were domestic political constraints. And in the US, the domestic political constraints were sort of, will just be blunt about it, that people didn't care all that much. It's not like Obama felt a huge amount of pressure to do something or to take a lot of risks, and Obama was in general kind of risk averse. And so, I think he was more prone to be sort of a fence sitter because of the domestic political mood. But that's not an adequate answer to your question. I think in retrospect, if we could have foreseen what was coming, I don't think that the US had to antagonize Russia across the board or begin a new global Cold War against Russia in 2014. I think what should have been done was a methodical, careful, and uninhibited program of beginning a serious military relationship between the United States and Ukraine, that would have started to build up Ukraine's conventional military resources. So that was, understood as too provocative to Russia in 2014. And the payment for that, or the kind of reward for that, sensitivity to Russian interests or to Russian, sort of needs, is the February 2022 war, when the US very rapidly begins to arm Ukraine and is now engaged in a process in the middle of a war, which is much more difficult. I know, Valerian, you had wanted to talk about deterrence. If we were to go back in 2014 and to think in terms of deterrence, it wouldn't have been about sending US uniformed soldiers to fight in Ukraine, but it would very much have been about building up a conventional military capacity. Actually, Poroshenko, the president who comes in after Yanukovych, does a lot to modernize Ukraine's military. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but it could have been faster, it could have been more comprehensive, and it could have had more, or it could have had some US assistance. That, in retrospect, I think was a pretty glaring policy error.
Good. I see the next question is about the US elections and the consequences of that. So I'll get to that. But before I get to that, I want to pick up on this kind of the Europe issue, and then the differences. You mentioned in the book that Europe, two things you mentioned. Europe was unprepared for war psychologically, intellectually, militarily.
Yes.
But you also say that one of the consequences of the 2022 was that it transformed Europe. So I wanted to ask, has Europe been transformed in all those psychologically, intellectually, militarily, fully? Like what is the level of that transformation in your view that we are seeing in Europe? And is it enough in your mind to not do half measures?
It's not quite enough yet. I think it's impossible to argue that, and I hope it doesn't take a kind of anti-European United States to get Europe to travel down this path. It's just better for Europe to do it on its own terms and by its own devices. The key insights have all been made, I think, about the importance of building up European military capacity of deterring Russia outside of Ukraine. That's not going to happen, by accident, and it shouldn't all just come from Washington. And I think people can, most Europeans can philosophically agree to that now. But, are you going to be willing to sort of deal with the financial and budget trade-offs that come with that kind of a commitment? And I think there's still a long path to travel. It's interesting to pose this as a kind of generational question. I think it may be that younger generations of Europeans really take the lead on this, and I do sense that happening. That there's sort of more an awareness that war is very much a European reality. You can't sort of get around that, and you can't place too many issues that far above war. For example, climate change, because if Europe is mired in war, it's going to be impossible to make any progress on climate change. You have to link these problem sets and do it in ways that are creative. So I have some optimism about younger Europeans, but I think that this has to be a transatlantic work in progress. So it's an especial pleasure, of course, to address younger people and to think about the conversations that, in a way, you need to have. I use the term intellectually there. I think it really matters in the sense that my own education had very little to do with war. I think most Europeans I kind of knew in the last 20, 30 years were not studying wars. They were not reading Thucydides. They were not reading these kinds of books. There was this kind of perception that this had become a thing of the past. And that, more than anything, in a way, has to change, because you're not going to be policy smart unless you have a lot of careful study behind it. And so, that's still probably a very important step. But the cultural shift is kind of there. The intellectual shift, I think, is happening. It's the budgetary shift that's certainly not there. It's not there in Germany. It's not there in a lot of other European countries. And so, we should probably put most of our focus on that.
Okay, great. Well, we have, talking about younger generation, I have a question from Zachary. So Zachary, go ahead and ask your question. Let me see. Let me make sure I give you the right to speak first. There you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So, Mr. Kimmage, my question is basically how you expect either a second Trump presidency or a second Biden presidency to impact the war in Ukraine. Speaking in reference to Biden, his last debate in June has shown to voters that perhaps he's not as sharp as he used to be, especially in regard to something as big as the war in Ukraine. And I'm also curious as to how you might consider a second Trump presidency to impact the war in Ukraine. Trump is the one president in which Putin did not chip away at Europe, and he is also a bit ambivalent to NATO. So I'm just curious as to how you might consider the two presidents.
Right. Well, these are great questions. I'll start with Biden. I think that if the war stays on the trajectory that it's currently on, I think Biden will do just fine. I mean, I think that he's versed in this conflict. I think he cares a lot about it. You see that he puts a lot of vigor into his voice and his speaking at the NATO summit, where these issues matter a lot to him, and even in the fight that he's sort of conducting now for the presidency, he said, well, which other Democrat has as many ties to other NATO leaders and others, and at this moment, and you can see how that sort of matters to him, and I think that he would certainly be as committed in a second term as he has been in the first term, and that is certainly very true for his staff as well. So if it's the current trajectory, I think you'll kind of see a status quo commitment, but not a tapering off. I think where the serious concerns might come in for a second term Biden presidency, and if you study the American presidency, beware of the second term, because it's always somehow harder than the first term, and you can find this with a lot of different presidents. It's definitely the case with Obama on foreign policy, and so that's just a kind of consideration to bear in mind. I think that the nightmare scenario for the United States is that it becomes a Israel-Hezbollah war as well as an Israel-Hamas war. That Iran starts to really profoundly destabilize the region. That the Middle East becomes a place where you need a huge amount of American military attention, and of course that if there would be some kind of move on Taiwan on China's part, that we now have. Let's put it this way in kind of semi-mathematical terms. It's sort of 1.5 big military crises for the U.S., one in Europe and half of a crisis in the Middle East. If that becomes 2, or if that becomes 3, Middle East, Asia, Europe, you're going to need maximum agility, sort of speed, skill, talent from an American president, and I don't want to really weigh in too much on the election, but obviously that's a question that's going to be sort of debated between now and November. When it comes to Trump, of course, beware any predictions one makes about this particular political actor who likes to sort of shake things up and be unpredictable. I don't foresee Trump pulling out of Ukraine or pulling out American support for Ukraine. I think he might try at the beginning of his presidency to kind of do things with diplomacy. I don't think that they'll succeed. I don't think an American president, whoever it would be, could kind of go in and quote unquote solve the war in Ukraine. So I don't think diplomacy is going to get him very far. I don't think he's going to want to pull out. And so I've written about this in a Wall Street Journal piece. I've speculated about the possibility of Trump escalating U.S. military commitment to Ukraine. I think he may be pushed to do so by circumstance. In some ways, he may be pushed to do so by Putin if Putin is sort of frustrated with the lack of a compliant partner in Washington. And one thing that Trump really liked to be in his first term, if that's what it was, he really liked to be the anti-Obama. So if Obama did X, Trump was inclined to do Y. And so I wonder if Biden is unwilling to let the U.S. materiel be used to strike within Russia, or if he's unwilling to sort of consider more certain kinds of sophisticated weaponry to send to Ukraine. I wonder if Trump might actually be different. I wouldn't confidently make that prediction. I just feel like that's the scenario that we don't discuss enough when it comes to Trump. And to me, it seems pretty plausible and realistic.
Great. Okay, so we have one more question from the audience, and I'll have one more after that, and we'll be wrapping up. So let's go to Jujar. Jujar, I'll unmute you now, and you can go ahead and ask the question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmage, for speaking with us. So according to multiple news outlets, NATO members are likely to declare that Ukraine's path to NATO membership is irreversible, and it's only possible once the war with Russia ends, and when the country undertakes a series of democratic reforms. And I was really curious about what are some of the internal and external obstacles facing Ukraine in its bid for full NATO membership, how you think about how countries who are in the alliance, but that are also friendly with Russia, will impact its accession,
Right.
and how you think that this will impact Putin's decision to prosecute the conflict or negotiate a settlement.
Great. So let me start a little bit with Putin and then go back to NATO, and I'll add one element to your question that wasn't necessarily implicit, but I think practical steps that NATO could take, short of membership, are also really important to highlight at the present moment. I don't think that this conflict, and this is certainly the argument that I make in the book, I don't think it revolves around NATO. I don't think NATO membership was imminent for Ukraine in 2021 or 2022. And I also think, this is hypothetical, I don't have the evidence for this, but I believe it, that if Putin had pulled back in February 2022 instead of invading, I think he could have gotten concessions resembling no NATO membership for Ukraine, maybe not from the US, but in some other form. And so if that's what he was driving at, I don't think that he needed war to get there. And I just don't see the whole NATO issue as deeply explanatory of Putin's motivations. We could go back to the point that Valerian and I were going over earlier about, strategic concerns that Russia has in Ukraine, but also a kind of neo-imperial purview. And that to me is much more an explanation for things over the last 2.5 years. So I'll just start with that point. In terms of obstacles, as you ask about, NATO is created in the late 1940s. It's created for a certain geography, and it's created for a certain historical moment. And it's not especially well designed for a country that is as big as Ukraine, and that's in the midst of a massive military conflict. So practically speaking, there are a lot of concerns. What do you do about the borders? Do you assume that Crimea is going to be in NATO or not in NATO? Do you, sort of truncate Ukraine? And although people argue that this was the issue with West Berlin, and, we sort of solved it with West Berlin, so we can do it with Ukraine, West Berlin was not in the midst of a big war in the late 40s and early 50s when it joined the alliance. So it's just harder. That stuff has to be dealt with, and probably has to be dealt with in a way that you may not get from the 1949 NATO Charter. Maybe you're going to have to think in new terms about how NATO works, but that's hard for an alliance that is, in a way, as illustrious and venerable as the NATO alliance. So there's the question of borders and how you protect, and sort of what Article 5 would mean in the midst of war. And I'll confess I find it kind of maddening to say that Ukraine could join NATO when the war is over, because it's like saying, well, when there's no longer a problem, we'll be able to solve the problem. But, you know, I can kind of understand why it's said on the other hand, but it speaks to this issue of how tricky it is to make the logistics work. And then you also ask about external factors. So of course, you know, Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia at the moment might veto NATO membership for Ukraine. I don't know about the US Congress. It's not, I think, a guarantee that US Congress at the present moment would be, you know, sort of gung-ho about NATO membership for Ukraine. So that's an issue. I think Germany is probably would use excuses, but would not really want to do it. And, you know, that's, of course, a big problem. How do you sort of work through just the politics of it? And I don't think anybody at the current moment has a good answer to that. But it's, you know, as you're asking about obstacles, that's certainly one of the big ones. But I would want to end my answer to your question on a somewhat more optimistic note. You know, maybe NATO membership is just not the necessary vehicle. You know, maybe there are forms of support that can run either through alliance headquarters in Brussels or through NATO member states that are just as good and that don't entail the politics and all the kind of treaty making that's there in the alliance. Maybe there are kind of logistical ways to do it, to give something that's the equivalent of Article 5 that is done in a kind of practical case-by-case basis that provides Ukraine with the security it needs, but, you know, sort of gets there faster than if it's just a binary question of NATO membership or non-membership. And since Valerian, I know that you would be interested to discuss this question from the vantage point of Georgia, perhaps if that succeeds in Ukraine, as I think Western policy is going to do, I think Western policy is going to succeed in Ukraine. If that succeeds in Ukraine, it may create models and templates for Georgia, where some of these logistical questions apply, right? What do you do about the border and the territories? And some of the political questions apply as well. So I don't think we need to tear our hair out about what's not there in terms of NATO's relationship to Ukraine. I think we could rather be sort of constructive and creative about what is there and think of it as a floor or a foundation that you can build upon. But let us not be too caught up in the year 1949 and all of the, you know, sort of early history. Let's try to be more forward-looking and sort of 21st century in the way that we think about these questions.
Right. Now, in other words, kind of focus on the goal and the aims rather than kind of how do you get there. Okay, last question that I want to ask about is, you know, we talked about the collisions, the beginning of the title. The title ends with the global instability, new global instability. So I want to touch on a little bit to get your perspectives on the global implications of this war. Now, one of the questions, the first one was about Russia isolated. You mentioned how that's not necessarily the case. Yes, Russia is decoupled from the West, and it has been decoupled from the West, but, you know, it's getting closer. I mean, historically, it's always been close to with India, but China, it's getting closer with China. So I wonder if you could tell us, how do you kind of, what are the consequences on this? Are we kind of in a new Cold War with Russia and China getting together closer? And then what is that new instability that kind of you hint at in the title?
Great. Okay, so there's a lot to say, and I'll try, Valerian, not to be long-winded.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
In answering this question, because when we get to the global, of course, there's so many different threads that that one could one could look to. Maybe I'll just be a little bit on the basic side and give one piece of bad news about this and one piece of good news when it comes to the global dimension to the conflict. The bad news, I think, is this, and to me, it's not so much that there's a kind of lockstep axis of the aggrieved, you know, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China. I don't see a very high degree of coordination among these four countries, and I think we want to be careful in Washington or in the US not to overstate the case in terms of how closely aligned these countries are. If we go back historically to the relationship between the Soviet Union, Communist China, there was actually a lot of space between the two countries, and sometimes we lump them together too categorically, and I worry a little bit about that at the present moment. So the bad news to me is not so much that we have a giant coordinated global threat coming from these four countries. It's more that Russia has shown that it can kind of do what it's doing. And that goes back to the answer I gave earlier to the question about whether Russia's isolated or not. You know, Russia's not. Its economy has muddled through. I don't think the price that Russia has paid as a country for the war in Ukraine is especially high. And that has a lot to do with the global implications of the war. I also don't think when it comes to public opinion, obviously it's hard to measure, but public opinion is not especially running against Russia. In some ways, I think it's the US that struggled to find its place within global public opinion with the war more so than Russia has. And that to me is the kind of the bad news about the war, is that a big war like this can be conducted, it can be funded, it can be kind of justified to the extent that Russia needs to do so in international fora. And all of that has seemed sort of to work. And so we need to think, the sort of final point I'll make here before turning to what I think is a bit of good news, we need to think about how other countries might imitate this, whether it's China in the midst of a big conflict with Europe and the United States, if they could seek to globalize their base of support in the way that Russia has, or other countries. It's not just something to worry about vis-a-vis Russia, it's something to worry about vis-a-vis other countries that might think of big conflicts they can use, that they could try to get away with, and to globalize sufficiently that they can continue to prosecute, because Russia is something of a role model in that regard, negative role model at the present moment. What's the good news when it comes to the global implications of the war? I think a point that doesn't get the respect and attention that it deserves. And this is the enormous global coalition that is there to support Ukraine. Now, we all sort of applauded how Zelensky put this together in the first few months of the war, but it's still there. We always focus on cracks in the edifice and fissures within the alliance, and is there daylight between Germany and the United States, and sort of who's fighting with whom. Fine, that's good journalism, but this coalition is enormous. It has a big financial component. It's has a big security component. It has a big kind of political democracy component as well, and it's not failing. So I just want to emphasize that we all, I think, are aware that Europe, the United States, Canada are supporting Ukraine, but it's also South Korea, which has been enterprising and effective in its support. It's also Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, and very importantly, Japan as one of the keystone countries that's supporting Ukraine. So this bodes very well for Ukraine's future, that it will be embedded within a certain kind of global order. Not every country on the globe, but it will be embedded in a global order. And, sort of a final point, which I'll make as a historian, if you look at wars of attrition, which is what this war is, a lot has to do with the coalitions that are at work. Can go back to the First World War and sort of understand why Germany loses, because it's just not that effective in the end at a war of attrition, whereas the Allies are, and there are similar, similar dynamics in the Second World War. That huge coalition that Ukraine has is going to help it a lot in the war of attrition that it's fighting at the present moment. So their globalization is not a negative, not a sort of dark story, but actually one that's relatively encouraging, and may become more so in the months and years to come.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. We could go on and talk a lot more, and there's a lot more historical insight, lessons learned, as well as advice for the future in the book. So I hope all of you are able to, sparked enough interest to get the book and delve deeper into this valuable analysis that Michael has provided, and hopefully it's something that helps sustain the coalition that you mentioned, that will be critical for the Ukrainian people to win, and for stability. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing this book, and we'll look forward to hosting you in the future. And we'll look forward to you, or the audience, for joining us for future events. We love books at AHS, and we hold a lot of book talks, as our students also organize book clubs as well. So we'll look forward to having you next time. Take good care.
Valerian, thank you so much for your great questions, and thanks so much to the great questions from the AHS community.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Have a good day.